Hi, everyone. Welcome to week 13. This is the last week in which I'm going to present new ideas, new information for you. For the next couple weeks, you will take center stage, and it will be your presentations that make up the core of the asynchronous classwork. I'll do one more quick one for week 15, just as a kind of summation, but it'll only be a few minutes, and it won't be about new theories. I'm going to try to keep this one quick because we also want to do individual meetings this week. Remember that, and you'll see that in the post, the meeting schedule sign up. I think it's really important so we can touch base regarding your research and where you stand on your presentation. And I'm also going to be asking you if you'll be ready to present for next week. So the idea is that half the presentations will be posted for next week, week 14, and the other half will be posted for week 15. As soon as you're ready, I'll talk about the timeline and everything in our meetings, but as soon as you're ready, you'll post it, share the link with me, and I'll create the weekly checklist from there. I think it's going to be really interesting. And as a side note, when it comes to presenting, preferential grading treatment for anyone who's completely ready recorded for week 14. So remember that. Bear that in mind and think about whether or not you can have it done for next week when we meet for our discussion. So again, I'm going to try to keep this quick. My goal here is to go over the readings for this week and talk about some of the ideas that have brought design to where it is today and where it's going in the future. We'll end with one last discussion topic that touches on those points, and we'll sort of build from there. So again, we had a number of options, and I hope you found them interesting. I want to hear which ones you read, and I hope that they were also informative for your research. I'm going to sort of do a laundry list of all of those and talk about why I think they're important for design today. The first one was called Design and Reflexivity by Jan van Toorn. Actually, van Toorn is the only deceased writer from everyone that we saw. This is the oldest article from the options this week, going back to 1994. And van Toorn was sort of a bridge between modern design in the sense that we looked at it in the high modernist school from Paul Rand and the Swiss typographic school to the postmodern and contemporary design. He was older than most of the designers that we were reading this week. He was 88 years old when he died in 2020. What's also interesting about the article from Jan van Toorn, Design and Reflexivity, is that he's building his ideas from a generation of theorists and philosophers that came after Roland Barthes. So thinking about that idea, which I mentioned about structuralism, there's a movement that follows called post-structuralism, which he's referencing heavily in this article. He mentions many authors, including Michel Foucault, Gilles Deleuze, Félix Guattari, Pierre Bourdieu. If you're noticing that those are all French names, it's again because it was a French movement. And another Frenchman who was sort of outside that fray was Jean Baudrillard. This generation of thinkers challenged the very core of our knowledge, asking questions about how we know what reality is and how we know that the knowledge we acquire throughout our lives is really true to life, and whether or not it's conditioned by a number of social circumstances. I think what's interesting in this article is that van Toorn is not only applying those theories to design, but he also seems to be building from the Stephen Heller article in some ways, right? This kind of picks up very nicely from where we left off last week. He talks about this idea of reflexivity. He questions whether or not design can really be critical of itself. Are designers ever really questioning the norms of the medium, or are designers always subject to commercial interests? if it's something that's always done for hire, can you ever really critically examine it deeply in a really meaningful way? Or is it always just ways of figuring out what sells best, right? And he conjures all these sort of uh, deep, deep philosophical ideas to ask those questions. And in doing so, he again he sort of brings up some ideas that might recall the Stephen Heller article, in the sense that sometimes movements exist outside the fray. Sometimes something emerges in the underground, and maybe it really offers a deep criticism. But as it becomes commercially successful, we have to wonder whether or not the criticism is watered down, whether or not it can really question the norm of the medium, or whether it's just sort of slightly altering the rules in order to sell more product. These are really the problems that Von Thorn is asking. And his own design did that. He often incorporated design ideas into publications that question similar notions. So in terms of a designer who also presents new ideas, Von Thorn is really interesting. And I hope somebody, especially if you've read this article, somebody who might be interesting to look at for future reference, and somebody who offers really deep, meaningful ideas about design. Another designer who questions the very form, and maybe not quite as sort of philosophical, but certainly much more fun, is Kalle Laazen. Again, the founder of Adbusters, which again sort of dovetails pretty nicely from last week. Laazen created this essay. It's actually, this is only an excerpt from a much longer essay, where he raises this notion of design anarchy, not just questioning whether or not we can criticize design from within, but demanding that designers, should you have the stomach for it, act outside of the norm, not just to question whether or not we can sort of be critical, but to completely upend the entire capitalist system. That's been his idea. He plays off of the norms of advertising. He plays off of the norms of magazine culture and now meme culture to really try to disrupt the system. And he's having a great deal of fun with it and encouraging a great deal of fun. But this kind of anarchy is really intended to subvert the world in which design has created, asking whether or not good design is always goodwill. If we want to look back at the Paul Rand article, right? Remember this optimism about corporate culture. Kalle Laazen sees that as consumerism gone astray. We buy more and more stuff for absolutely no reason. And it's the designs that sell it which motivate us to buy those things. And if design is doing that, if design is creating endless piles of garbage and endangering the environment in doing so, and creating negative body images for individuals and making people feel alienated from the world around that, maybe it's not such a good thing. Maybe designers need to rethink what design does and how it should be used. And maybe anyone who's bowing to corporate interests needs to really reconsider their motivations. This is all part of Kalle Laazen's ideas. And again, it's a longer manifesto. You can find the rest of it online, and it's very well worth reading. Or you can pick up some copies of Adbusters. Kalle Laazen also participates in a number of other activist fronts. More recently, he's a part of a group called Black Spot Collective that stages protests against corporate interests and corporate greed. And again, very well worth checking out, especially if you enjoyed this article. The next one that we're presented with, I'm moving in the order that they appear in the book. It's not necessarily chronological, but it actually sort of creates a nice flow. And so I'm going to stick with the order that that Helen Armstrong creates for us. The next one that appears in the order in the text, not necessarily chronological. We're jumping forward to 2006, as we did with the Kalle Laazen, and also 2006. is this article called Designing Our Own Graves by Dmitry Siegel. This one is all about prosumer culture. It's a really important idea, and it's absolutely a term that you should be familiar with. I first heard the term in relationship to photographic equipment, and it's the same for different sort of computer equipment and things like that. You have consumer grade electronics, which are typically meant for the amateur. This is very true for cameras, right? You have a sort of a point and shoot camera that your parents might use. And then you have a professional camera, which is the sort of highest of the high end, the most expensive, but really has all the bells and whistles and typically demands a specialist knowledge to operate the equipment. In between those two things, you have what's called prosumer grade. It's something that a professional could use if they needed to, although it's not quite the same quality, but is also geared towards the consumer market. So technology companies have been blurring that line for a while. They've been making equipment that sort of crosses over. Dmitry Siegel recognizes that this is going one step further, that prosumer culture is taking over everything, and particularly taking over so many aspects of the field of design, right? You interact with things like WordPress, right? I've got news for you. I didn't design the class website from the ground up. I'm using template software that generates a design for us, for me, right? And so I'm able to create a relatively good looking website very quickly using a cutout structure, using something that's prefabricated. Dmitry Siegel's concerned that if this is the way that design is going, it's going to change the profession entirely. He's right about some of the ways that happened. He talks about an early blogging software, but now when you look at web design in particular, you've got the takeover of Squarespace and Wix and all sorts of new design software that do the work for you. And there's more and more that do the branding for you as well. So what does this mean about the future of design? Will designers be out of work because everyone else can just create their company logo and their basic website for a very small cost? Have the designers who create this software put everyone else out of a job? And if so, is that actually a really bad thing? Or what does that mean for the designer? How does it change your relationship to your work? These are all very important questions. And we can push it even one step further when we understand that the software we interact with on a daily basis makes prosumers out of all of us. If you're posting your work onto Instagram, you're using this cutout template where everybody's posts look the same, but you're also interacting in a sort of hybrid type of way. You're the consumer of everyone else's Instagram posts, but you're also the producer of all the content on Instagram. There's no platform without the material everyone posts, right? And there's no audience without everyone looking at that. And that's not just Instagram. Of course, it's also TikTok and Facebook and Twitter and every other social media app. We live in a very prosumer world, and we have to question what creativity looks like in that world. How has the shape of not just design, but all types of information and image and knowledge sharing, how have those things changed in the prosumer world, which has only become amplified in the, for 16 years, whatever it is, since Dmitry Siegel wrote this article. The background image here does not necessarily have to do exactly with that. It's just a project. Dmitry Siegel, one of his many design projects was the most recent rebranding for Patagonia. And you see their catalogs and things like that. So it's just sort of a nice placeholder for the type of thinking that Dmitry Siegel is employing. Also, another sort of placeholder image, when we look at Jessica Helfand, who's the author of Dematerialization of screen space. I believe in the beginning, the Winter House is mentioned in the introduction, which is Jessica Helfand's studio in Connecticut. She shared it with her spouse and partner, William. Sorry, make sure I'm pronouncing it right. William Drentel. He actually passed away in 2018, I believe. So she runs the Winter House studio by herself now, but this is sort of the nexus of their space, and they hold workshops and residencies, and it's a kind of collaborative space in which many innovative design projects, from which many innovative projects have emerged. I think it's also sort of funny to look at this very physical space that represents part of Jessica Helfand's practice in contrast to the dematerialization of the screen space that she talks about. I'll show you a couple more images for this one just to keep it interesting, but she's building from some of the questions and concepts regarding media that we saw earlier in the semester. And I'm showing you this because I think there's a very powerful contrast to be created between this very simple idea of electric circuitry as a sort of extension of ourselves that Marshall McLuhan offered us, and the state of things now. So back in the 60s, we had this image. Today we have this. This is a visualization of the internet, right? Every server, every central data point acts as these sort of nodes from which many other links connect from. So we really have created this system, this network that resembles the human brain. We've put ourselves, we've projected ourselves outward using electric circuitry. The internet really is a set of physical connections. As much as we talk about the cloud and things like that, there are servers somewhere that connect to either broadband hardware or physical lines, which bring the information to us. And we're very much dependent on that. And this article from 2001, Dematerialization of Screen Space, Jessica Helfand addresses ways in which these sort of utopic visions for the internet do or do not take place. At the time, the internet was seen as this sort of limitless plane. You had all these open spaces. Anyone could very inexpensively purchase a website, start building something from the ground up. And it was basically sort of free digital property. The idea was that it could expand outward anywhere, and all these new technologies would come that would make it a limitless plane. And in some ways, that's true. In some ways, we have entered this world where we can cross boundaries effortlessly. But on the other hand, we've also become trapped, as I am right now, in this little box, right? And we stare at these little screens. As much as they're portable, as much as we can access the internet from everywhere, we're always locked in these little devices. We're always captured. We still follow web pages, typically follow the idea of a big sheet of paper that's scrolling in front of the screen and moving around in multiple directions, but it's on these very small surfaces in which we're fully engrossed all the time. Again, this article is written in 2001, and the extent to which it's true has only been magnified today. One thing that we should note, all of these articles, the most recent is from 2008. And that's right around the time when there's a really massive shift in the way we interact with not just screen space, but with information in general. And you should recognize that it's the introduction of the smartphone, right? Primarily the iPhone and all of the others that follow. These devices radically altered the ways that we access the internet and the ways that we communicate with one another. There's been a substantial shift in the ways that we process information about the world, the speed at which we see information, and the scale at which we interact with images. Most of us are not even looking at the sort of the limited, tight little 13-inch laptop screen anymore. We're down to an even smaller 5 or 6-inch screen on a portable device. And we're very much locked into these boxes, even though we can take the boxes anywhere. It's a very sort of complicated set of questions that arises regarding the bigger philosophical implications of our interactions. And it's very relevant for design because it has absolutely changed the way that we interact with the printed word and with the images that shape our lives. Moving on, and as a sharp contrast to Jessica Helfand's article, Kenya Hara offers us this text called Designing Design, which is essentially an anti-technology statement or manifesto. Kenya Hara sees design as something that should be very physical in the real world and should defy technology. We should work against something newer, fresher, smarter all the time, and think about the sort of basic essentials that are long lasting, that are durable, that don't need to be replaced every couple of years. This is what Hara is talking about in this article. And you may know that Kenya Hara is not just the designer behind the advertisements for Muji, but the brand manager for the entire company. So things like these cleaning products pictured here are also reviewed by Kenya Hara. And this is part of a new type of design strategy that's all encompassing, right? There's this idea that's sort of funny. Well, Herbert Bayer was creating beautiful advertisements for the Container Corporation of America, and Paul Rand was creating these incredible graphics for IBM and so many other companies. Those designers never touched the products. They didn't care whether or not the boxes were good looking or whether or not the computers actually worked. Kenya Hara extends the design through everything the company does. And that's a pretty radical change in how we think about the designer's role, and one that I think should be embraced if we want to think about this idea of goodwill. As a total side note, sadly, when we look at this book, which is now falling apart in my hands, Graphic Design Theory, we have a healthy dose of contemporary women writers, but Kenya Hara is the only person of color at all in this entire book. So that tells us something about the kind of historical, and again, we're coming up on the contemporary, but I think it does tell us something about the field of design. I'd say for better or worse, but it's for worse. So it's something to bear in mind. At least it's something of another voice, but there's not nearly enough in this text, if you ask me. More on that in a second. The next article that you had the option of reading from 2008, this is the newest one in the entire book, which was published in 2008. It's called Import Export or Design Workflow for Contemporary Aesthetics. I think Lev Manovich poses a really interesting question at the beginning of this, or sort of an interesting idea at the beginning of this article. He talks about the fact that the import-export functions, copy and paste, is not just a simple tool. It's the entire framework, the entire underlying structure behind how we work in digital media today. And I have to say he's got a pretty good point here. The image you're seeing here is actually, incidentally, it's one of Lev Manovich's design projects. If you just Google his name, you can find his website and find so many of the projects that he's worked on. This is one in which he aggregates data to create a moving picture of Broadway, tracing it from all the way downtown, all the way uptown. He gives us it's a site that's just designed to aggregate information from other sites. So we see at the top the Google Street View of every facade on Broadway, the Street View looking up at every location, which is just kind of a fun, different angle. And then all sorts of data from Instagram. This is going back to This was completed in 2015, the project. So it's no longer live. It would probably be overwhelmed with Instagram data if it still was. But it shows you how the colors change at different locations, and how you can sort some of the images to see only portraits taken or selfies taken at different locations. It's a really fascinating project, and this is on par with some of the design work that Lev Manovich does. But returning to import-export, he talks about this fundamental shift that occurs in digital media. And in thinking about this, I can't help but share an image from the Star Wars franchise, just because I think that this is wild. When you see this picture here, it's a little fuzzy, but we have a frame with a gel on it. It's a transparent piece of film in which the typography has been laid out. It's not done digitally. This is all hand-done typography. And you'll notice that this is the title crawl from The Empire Strikes Back. And what happened was this giant bed is made for this, a camera is mounted above, and somebody sits there and pushes the letters across the frame at the correct speed. You can see how it actually, it actually goes from far back and closer. I guess it starts actually closer and closer, moves further back. You can see how that perspective works. That's how this was done. It was difficult to make any kind of graphic design, set it in motion, right? To make it a piece of a film. And that's why film and graphic design and animation all remain distinct fields. But what Lev Manovich points out is that now all design seems to be moving, and the integration of design elements and illustrations into contemporary movies is so easy because we have these technologies. And again, he's writing this in 2008, but when we look at some of the movies that have recently come out, these animated Spider-Man films that incorporate illustration over digital graphics, he's absolutely right. And it's still changing. It's still evolving. We still have these new forms emerging. We're still processing what the import-export commands can really do for us. And then finally, the last article, whoops, I left an additional slide from last week. There we go. The last article that you had the option to read, speaking of striking back, was Universe Strikes Back. In this article, Ellen and Julia Lupton question the idea of universality. Remember, we talked about this a bit when we encountered designers like Herbert Bayer, who wanted to create an alphabet that would be fully universal. And we talked about some of the problems that can lie within that approach. And many postmodernists abandon that idea entirely. Ellen and Julia Lupton are asking here whether or not maybe there's some room for universality. Maybe there are different designs that can transcend cultural boundaries while maintaining some of their local character. Maybe there are ideas that speak to us across borders, even if they're not, even if they're not part of one dominant worldview. Maybe there is some room for that. And maybe that's what the new avant-garde should discover. Maybe working to find the ideas that touch people's lives and the designs that improve people's lives around the world should be the goal of designers in the future. Again, it's a sort of quick summary, but that's the idea of this last really interesting article, which makes for a nice kind of endpoint for this text. Remember, we started with an article from this text when we've jumped around in this course, going through a number of different ideas that are not included in this one little theory textbook. But we've started at the beginning and we're ending at the end of this book, where we began by asking, what is the new avant-garde? And now there's one proposed solution through Ellen Lupton. We've talked about Ellen Lupton a lot. We've actually seen many more texts and heard from her a bit more from everyone else. And there's a good reason for that. She is, again, the most prominent, one of the most interesting, and I think one of the most powerful voices in design and design theory today. She continues to be. Again, this book was published in 2008, so we're still more than 10 years away. We're still a long ways off from where design is today. And a lot has changed since then, not just in technology, but in an awareness of the voices that need to be heard in design. Ellen Lupton continues to be innovative, and one of her recent projects, which I feel I must recommend, and sort of if there's one text that gives you a framework for moving forward, I think it's this one. It's called Extra Bold, a feminist, inclusive, anti-racist, non-binary field guide for graphic designers. And it's co-edited by Ellen Lupton and Jennifer Tobias, with contributions from many others. So it's not just one voice trying to impart all the rules of design, from a sort of ivory tower. This is a very practical, hands-on guide. This is what design looks like moving forward. And if anything, I hope that what we've covered so far gives you a good foundation to build from. It's texts like this one that I think are going to be the future, that are going to offer new ideas and start laying the groundwork for a new generation of ideas and theories, and more importantly, a new generation of designs that will look at all different viewpoints and offer more possibilities for more people. So that's one recommendation for future reading. To end, I want to bring up one more discussion point, and it's not really a new one. I want to go again back to the beginning. And remember, we looked at the start at this idea of what is design. Remember, I posed this question and it turned into a really interesting discussion. I appreciate all the interesting discussions that have come up through the semester. I thought this would be a fun one to revisit now. And I'm going to give it one little twist and say, what is design today? Remember, we had all these questions about like what makes design. I'm not going to make it as formal this time. You're just going to comment on this post with your ideas about what is design today. But think about this from the perspective of how has design changed? What is really the role of the designer today? One of the common themes that we've seen throughout is some kind of functionality. It could be communication. It could be a sort of practical real world application. How has functionality changed in the new world? What does it mean for a good design to improve someone's lives today? So I want one more last thought. Maybe it changes from what we've read. Maybe it's built on some of the things that we've looked at, but consider what is not just design today, but what is good design today? And what creates the right sort of design that's really going to improve people's lives? That's the last set of comments for my discussions. You're going to have many more comments to add to one another's presentations. And I think we're going to really enjoy seeing what everyone has to offer. So can't wait to see what you post for this one. Looking forward to all the comments. And you won't hear from me next week, but you'll start seeing one another's presentations. You'll see the post for that as well. As always, let me know if you have any questions. And again, looking forward to seeing your responses. Thanks.